Good afternoon, everybody. Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you. Does every event have to start with me saying, is this on? Sorry, it's like a commercial. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danny Pletka. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome, I don't know whether to say welcome or welcome back. I know you've been here, George. David, have you been here before? So you can get a pen too. To welcome David Albright and George Perkovich, both of whom are very good friends and really two people who I think are absolutely perfect to discuss the impending possibility, maybe, we'll decide in the next hour, of a nuclear deal between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council in Germany and the Islamic Republic of Iran. George is the, I'm going to get your title wrong, so George, I'm going to look, is the Vice President for Studies and the Director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And David, how many times have you heard this in the last 3 months? David is a physicist and founder of the Institute for Science and International Security, and the reason that I'm looking at it is because I always call it ISIS, and David, of course, is not a founder of ISIS.
Yes, I am, the real ISIS.
Yes, that's right. The grave injustice that has been done to your organization. It is,
That's right.
Yes, exactly, and I'm sure you've heard that at least a dozen times. I apologize for repeating it. In any case, the way we're going to do this is what is increasingly our habit here at AEI, which is that we're going to have a conversation rather than presentations. I will happily, after we have a conversation among ourselves, involve the audience in that, but we're really just trying to illuminate some of the questions that are outstanding and see, as we are sort of 3 to 4 weeks away from the self-imposed deadline on the various parties, whether in fact a deal is in the offing. Let me ask you both, and you can fight with each other for the privilege. Is there going to be an agreement on November 24th? Yes? No?
Who's more certain of the two of us?
Well, I mean, I would say I don't see how there would be a comprehensive, quote, final deal that has all of the really pertinent details worked out that you could then go out and say, okay, now we just have to implement it. That to me is unimaginable. Could there be some kind of agreement that looks a little bit like the joint plan of action that was agreed a year ago, but adds some more detail, or is kind of joint plan of action 2? Yeah, I can imagine that, but not a final deal. It's okay, this is how for the next 15 years this issue is going to be managed with all the verification, et cetera. I don't see that.
I want to ask you about the sticking points, but first, what?
Yeah, I'm a little more pessimistic. I mean, I think you could at least expect an extension of some type. There may have to be some innovative provisions added. Like in July, there was one added that Iran committed to turn some of the oxide enriched uranium into fuel elements for the Tehran research reactor, which makes it, in a sense, time-wise further from being able to be used in a centrifuge again. And in that sense also moves the agreement a little bit further, saying that pure oxide form is not acceptable. It's not enough to satisfy the U.S. concerns about conversion and reuse in a centrifuge. But it's just there, as George mentioned, I mean, there's so many issues unsolved, and in end of July, I think what I heard, I was in Vienna at the end, and heard from negotiators was Iran has got to come to reality. It has to start making the significant concessions, instead of saying that they had no nuclear weapons program and refused to engage with the IAEA. They have they want 100 to 150,000 centrifuges, not just the 20,000 or so they have installed. And so until Iran starts to make those concessions, I don't see how you can do anything but extend.
So, I mean, there's so much to talk about. The first question being how they ever thought they could come to an agreement in a year in the first place, maybe. But ambition is certainly not a crime when it comes to doing something as important as this is. So let's start with the glass half empty, just to sort of surprise all of you. I mean, let's start with the glass half full instead. What are the important concessions? George, we're always a little bit more optimistic about the possibilities here. What are the important concessions that the Iranians have made that have a a more irreversible quality?
In terms of, I mean, David would be able to better answer physically about things that could be irreversible, but I can't think of many, which doesn't surprise me in a sense that from a political and strategic point of view, as they or anybody else would think about it, as much as we don't trust them, they trust us less. So for the reason that you're asking about irreversibility is, obviously we want to have leverage and you don't expect that they're going to do things. Well, they don't expect that we're going to deliver on any agreement either. So for that reason, they want to have reversibility to be able to reapply leverage to us when we don't deliver on the sanctions relief or whatever else that would be. So I don't think there's much irreversibility there. Moreover, what we're talking about and what we're focused on, for example, the number of centrifuges in declared facilities, it addresses one concern, but it doesn't address the concern about potential secret facilities. So if you think they have secret facilities, then they haven't reversed anything by definition. So it's kind of a concept that, to me, I get why it's desirable that there be irreversibility, but it seems to me kind of not the way to look at it.
I would, in the negotiation though, the irreversibility played out with the Iraq reactor, where the
Right.
The idea was that the core, the metal core, has to be taken out and replaced by one that just wouldn't be large enough to allow the reactor to go back to using natural uranium, or even a kind of plutonium diversion scenarios. That
That's a good point.
and that just increasing enrichment, lowering the power wasn't enough. Where we hear in the media, and I think it's true, the U.S. has floated the idea that there wouldn't be destruction of centrifuges, because that's irreversible. That it would instead be removing the pipe work and calculating it would take many months to put back in the pipe work, and that time gain would be valuable. But the original idea was destruction. So I think there's irreversibility that's been achieved. There's some that's been given up. And but we don't know the details, and it's fast moving. It's essentially a U.S.-Iran bilateral negotiation, or that's probably the dominant part, and so a lot is happening. I would imagine that we're not hearing anything about.
So the accusation that critics are making is that the Iranians have made no substantial concessions, particularly on the suspected military components of the program, while the Iranian interlocutors, and I would say actually the other interlocutors would say the United States, has actually been willing to move further in compromising with the Iranians about the end state of their program. Is that fair? Is it unfair?
Yeah, do you want me to go first? Yeah, I think it's complicated. I mean, on the military dimensions, Iran has taken the position that it's not going to give an inch. I mean, they have not satisfied the IAEA's concerns, and the IAEA is a very polite, diplomatic, international organization, but they've given no indication at all that Iran has addressed their concerns. And,
including in a visit just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah,
right.
And they have not allowed visits, and so you have it's one of the problems in the agreement. I mean, you want to have some progress on that before there's a deal would be signed, and how do you get that? And the IAEA certainly can't do the job in 3 weeks, and particularly when Iran doesn't cooperate. So that's a very difficult issue where Iran is, in a sense, holding out to the end, but just by holding out to the end makes it very hard to do anything. And so there's some things on the table that could work around that, but it's going to be pretty dramatic, allowing the IAEA to visit the Parchin site. And that's not enough because they've done so much renovation activity. The IAEA is asked to go to other sites related to the military dimensions. And they haven't surfaced publicly, but the IAEA knows where they want to go. The Iran knows where it needs to let them go. And so you need to see those visits, and you need to see some interviews with some of of the weapons scientists. And you need some resolution. And you know, one thing could be the IA could just say in November or December at the next Board of Governors meeting, just like they did in Syria on the reactor. In Syria, they said, despite our Syrian resistance and refusal to say anything, we feel it's very likely there was a reactor. The IA could do the same thing here. They could just say, we feel it's very likely they had a nuclear weapons program prior to 2004, and parts of it may have continued afterward up to today. And that, just leave it at that. And that could be part of a solution. Whether the Board of Governors would go along with that, I don't know.
But let me parse that out for a second, because if they do that, that solution suggests that Iran has an active nuclear weapons program that's possibly going on, and how does that factor into a solution?
Well, it would just lay on the table what the IA thinks and make it official, and that would be part of the justification of how the deal would then be developed.
But you could, I think some scenario like that is probably more likely than others, and in fact, it would be a relief probably in Iran to have the IAEA just make the judgment, because the hard thing is, I know there are people here who want a confession from Iran, but I don't think we're going to get that. Yes, it was a nuclear weapon program. Those words aren't going to come out. They might say, they might acknowledge doing certain experiments without describing their purpose and let other people characterize them, but just say, just the facts, ma'am, like you and you're probably not old enough either, but I'm old enough to remember Dragnet, Jack Webb, just the facts, ma'am. They might say these were facts, and then other people will say it was a weapon program, and they'll say, no, we just did these experiments. But I think that's the past, and the past is really important for reasons that David and others have written a lot about, to get more confidence about what you know about the future. But there are also things about the future that could be in an agreement while you say that at the end, or a certain form of sanctions relief that would come in 3 years will only come if the IAEA has been satisfied and there's been transparency. So you don't get the answers now, but they're part of the schedule of the deal, basically, that these things have to come later. You could also construct it to say, and in the meantime, all the parties understand that no such activities, and you can enumerate them, will henceforth be undertaken in Iran. So that
we'll pretend not to notice them if they do, or notice
them. That would be a different agreement. But that
the IA to be able, you want the IA to be able to investigate those. Because the IA is going to have to, and it's done, and Iran often acts like they're the only ones being singled out and being forced to accept inspections that no one else does. But in fact, to this day, South Africa has, and it allows the inspectors to visit the former nuclear weapons production sites, development sites. Taiwan has done that. You know, again, it's not a state, but it essentially accepted that kind of extra verification. And so Iran is going to have to allow the IA to continue to investigate its concerns. I mean, it'll reach a conclusion under this scheme, but it would still investigate those concerns until it was satisfied that its concerns had been addressed. And then what George is saying, you could tie sanctions relief to the final outcome of that investigation. So again, it's not satisfying. I mean, from my point of view, you want it done up front because you want to have confidence, like we did in South Africa, that the program has stopped. This has been accounted for.
This isn't going to be like that at all. Just
no. I think everybody's figured that one out.
Right.
It's not going to look like that. And no matter if there's an agreement, there's not going to be a lot of satisfaction. These, of course, there are so many incompatible pieces of this, and while I think many of us understand that there were obviously hidden elements to this, and that everybody is in a position of making maximalist demands and position taking in order to protect themselves politically or for other reasons. At the same time, it seems to me that one clear element that comes out of what both of the two of you understand, and that I've been reading a lot lately, is this sort of the past is the past. Oh, well, you know, mistakes were made, and they were bad. They were bad mistakes. But they were made, and we don't want to humiliate you, put it in a different sense, by making you fess up or by making you, take off all your clothes at Parchin. No, that's all okay. The problem is what does this do to the IAEA? What does this do to non-proliferation? What does this say to the neighbors? And what does this say to that coward, Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, about all of this? He's also a chicken shit, yes, sorry. But a coward too, don't forget. We could have fun and just talk about that, by the way, but we are not going to. We're relentlessly not going to have fun talking about that.
Don't let me.
We're not going to
I'd love
we're
to,
not going to have fun.
But I mean, at a certain moment, what are we achieving exactly here?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think from the I mean, you mentioned a number of considerations. I mean, and we don't know how it turns out, but I can imagine from the standpoint of the IAEA and non-proliferation, if there is a diplomatic agreement or step that over a period of years results in Iran not having nuclear weapons, that people will say from a non-proliferation point of view, that was a great success. It didn't go the way of North Korea, and it didn't go the way of Iraq. That would be, and they don't have the bomb. That's great. It was done diplomatically. And I think people would say the IAEA also did its job. It was called in to investigate beginning in 2003. It documented a lot of this. It put a lot of these things on the table. And if there were, if there's dissatisfaction or they didn't get all that they wanted, that would go to the Security Council as the, in a sense, the kind of enforcement body. But it need not be a commentary on the IAEA. I think most people think the IAEA has done a pretty good job in this. So.
Let me speak from what I hear from the IAEA point of view. This might surprise people, but under the traditional Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, the IAEA has a right to go anywhere in Iran. It's hard to exercise that right, and the additional protocol was developed to make it easier to exercise that right. But the right rests in the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, so they have it now. And under that, there's nothing about you can go to a civil site, but you can't go to a military site. And so one can argue, why didn't the IAEA push on this harder, call for what's in the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, a special inspection, and asked to go to Perchin under that. But set that aside, they have the right to go there, and if Iran, in a sense, gets away with this, what they've done is they've created a dichotomy, at least as a precedent, between civil sites and military sites.
Between civil nuclear programs and nuclear weapons
just
programs.
civil. Well, but that's
but isn't that fundamental?
No, but it's worse than that, because what you can do then is let's say they want to hide a gas centrifuge plant in the future. And Fordow is on a military base. And so you could create this dichotomy where Iran could say in the future, well, sorry, you accepted you couldn't go to a military site. In the past, you're going to have to accept that in the future. And so I think what the worry is that you weaken the verification effort on the effort to find secret sites. If Iran gets away with it in a sense.
But gets away with what in this case?
Not allowing the IAEA to go to where it needs to go. Perchin, other military sites, not be able to interview key scientists involved in those activities at those sites, and not addressing the IAEA's concerns.
Right,
so.
but that could, if an agreement is a 12-year agreement or a 13-year agreement, that could all be in phases of an agreement. So Danny's question was, if there's an agreement, what does this do to the IAEA or the non-proliferation regime? And what I'm saying is that if by the end of it they don't have a bomb, it looks pretty good, and presumably by the end of it there would be some more access to some of these facilities, or it wouldn't end in a sense.
Yeah,
that
well,
would
it'd be a permanent
right
conflict, because it also is true under the additional protocol rules. Every year the IAEA has to say, is this country in compliance? And every year it will say no, and it wants to do kind of a reckoning under the additional protocol. And it can take many years in the best of cases, like with Canada it took a long time, South Africa took a long time. And so you're going to put the IAEA in a position where it can never come to a conclusion under the additional protocol in Iran, and that's not good for the IAEA. It undermines the verification efforts. It's going to have impacts in other places, if at the end of 12 years they've come along and they've addressed all the IAEA's concerns, then maybe it's fine.
Right.
But what it does, though, is it shows that states that are non-compliant can in a sense, get benefits and remain in non-compliance for a very long period of time.
Isn't that the magic of the NPT?
I don't think it's a healthy development for the IAEA.
It's definitely not healthy, and and so is there are a lot of things that aren't. But compared to the alternatives in the real world, things could be a lot worse. It could be a lot worse if they got a bomb. Arguably, it'd be a lot worse if we had another big war there that went like the Iraq War. So the idea that Iran, which is my hypothetical, I'm not saying what happened, but that if there's an agreement and 12 years down the road they still don't have a bomb, and it's true that the IAEA still has some issues unresolved, that's not good. But compared to a whole bunch of alternatives, in the real world, it's not that bad. It looks a lot better than Pakistan, it looks a lot better than North Korea, it looks a lot better than Iraq, it looks a lot better than Libya right now. I mean, so in the real world,
yeah, but you don't know if that's going to be the real world.
No, I don't.
And I think if you weaken the verification, you can create incentives for cheating. And so you can increase the probability of it going bad.
We're in the real world now, so I agree with everything you said. So magically tell me how you're going to get the Iranians to do all of those things with the IAEA.
Well, one is they're going to have to make some concessions.
Oh, great.
How?
I mean,
one is they could let the IAEA go to the sites they want to visit now, and then that creates the precedent to go to military sites or reinforces the precedent.
I think they should. I agree. We're on the same side, but I'm saying if they don't, then
I think
we
all
don't
think
have
they
a deal.
won't.
I would actually say, extend the negotiations, but don't lock in a deal. That's what I would say.
I think we all agree that the Iranians are probably not going to let the IAEA go to these sites. They haven't so far. I don't think that they have the impression, maybe I'm wrong, that this is sort of like the goose and the golden egg at the end of the rainbow. I just picked 6 metaphors, sorry.
I was in Tehran in June and had a discussion with one of the negotiators about this. And from that point of view, they said, so we've given access before, and each time we were told, this was it. And so we go talk to the people who control these facilities, and we convince them to let it happen, and then they come, and then it turns out they want to go back again. So what's to reassure us that this won't be an unending process of the United States, the Zionist entity, whatever, putting out intelligence and continuing to pry into military sites without end and without due process or any other way that our interests are satisfied. And they use it for intelligence gathering, for targeting scientists, and so on. What assurance can you give us that that won't happen? And it's very difficult to do that. So we're kind of in between. We absolutely should be able to go to those sites. They were non-compliant. There were suspects. I agree with all that. But then they look and say, okay, how is that bounded? And how does it not become a vehicle for an unending, unresolvable?
Well, part of the answer is show me a place where that's ever happened outside of, I could say during parts of Iraq in the 90s, but in the safeguard context, the IA has actually been pretty restrained. And it's willing to allow sensitive information to be protected.
And this is what I said. I said, well, the IAEA will do that. And they pulled out WikiLeaks, and they said, and here's what your diplomats have said about the U.S. control of the IAEA Director General. We own him.
Yeah, but they didn't own El Barde, and they don't own Romano.
Didn't want to own him either. But let's just set this aside a second and say, first of all, this is what the Iranians signed up to, which is that if the IAEA believes that something is going on, that they in fact have the right to go in. So the notion that somehow the IAEA should willingly be or be forced to give up the safeguards agreement provisions seems to me to be a little bit of a ridiculous demand on the part of the Iranians. And of course, the entire notion, the entire mechanism of this, which is that you get these privileges based on your adherence to these safeguards agreements, is now kaput because you have not adhered, and in fact, you continue not to adhere. And we're going to say bygones be bygones, but in addition, in the future, you're still not going to adhere. Anyway, I think we sort of we've successfully at least achieved what we perceive to be going on. But now here's this additional problem that that I see, which is a very interesting one, and the conversation about other sites went away. Now, when I've talked and debated with Iranians, part of the challenge is not to talk about what we know. It's to talk about the fact that we only knew it when we knew it. And it was already done when we knew it. And of course, the suspicion is that given that everything Iran has done, whether it was Natanz or Fordow or continues to be at Parchin and elsewhere, was done in secret, what don't we know? And there are some who have suggested that because the Iranians are bargaining so hard and being so vehement that in fact this must represent the whole of their program. There's lots of certitude about that. But in fact, is there any reason to believe that this is the whole of their program?
Well, there is an argument that this is the bulk of the centrifuge program. I mean, there's parts that need to be fleshed out, and I'll mention those. But the getting caught over and over again you can see it causes them to react. And I think I personally think that let's say in the NIE in 2007, they said it was more likely they would go a covert route than using a declared. I think at that point in time, that may have been right. They had almost no centrifuges at a declared plant, and they had a secret construction project at Fordow, and so in that sense, the assessment was right. But the getting caught at Fordow was a big deal. It changed the Russian view. They got much more serious about imposing sanctions and started looking at Iran very differently after that. And so I think in this current period, I would say it's more likely they would build in concentrated declared sites than at covert sites. And one of the things that was clarified early on in the discussions between the U.S. and Iran was that there was no third centrifuge site. Because Iran had said we're building 10, and we're going to start on a third any time, and that time had passed. But they clarified there was no third site. So I think now it's probably the case that they are concentrating on declared places and declared capabilities. In the future, they may, as they develop confidence in their ability to camouflage and hide, they may go a covert route again, but using what they've done at declared places. And therefore, the focus is build up your capabilities as much as possible. Now, in the verification, where there's holes, is that it's very important to find out how many centrifuges have they made, and how many raw materials do they have, so you know how many they can make. Because if what I'm saying is true, then at some point they may try to go covert from the declared places. And so you really need a really good reckoning and baseline of all their capabilities to build centrifuges.
And you'd want to say, for example, and I don't know if you could get it, but just building on what David said, that there's only, in a deal, there would only be one legitimate centrifuge fabrication site. So you try to narrow it in to make it easier to then monitor and track resources and everything else. So in addition to wanting to know what materials they have, and say, wait, you're going to do this in one facility. So if you detect it someplace else, that's ipso facto a violation of an agreement rather than having things spread around. So there's ways to try to funnel. Yeah.
None of this Iran has agreed to, from what I understand. I mean, things can change, and at the last minute, they may come along. But this is all. There's something called Additional Protocol Plus. That is a set of conditions developed by the IAEA and member states that applies to states that are non-compliant. The idea is that if you're going to be cheating on deals, you're caught, proven, then you're going to have to accept additional requirements until, in a sense, confidence is restored. And the term would be in the absence of undeclared nuclear activities and facilities. And so, but the plus has not been accepted at all by Iran.
Well, in fact, they promised to sign the additional protocol and did not.
Well, but they've agreed in this that they will ratify the additional protocol.
They agreed that last time, and they didn't do it.
Well, they may not comply, but it's seen as not enough.
It is a remarkable power to be able to sell the same thing to people over and over and over again.
Well, that's unfair.
But that's not fair because they say they never got paid.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to go there.
Yeah.
So we're not going to thresh out these thorny issues by November the 24th. Something has to happen by November the 24th. There has to be an extension, or there has to be a new agreed framework, if I can call it that. And so what does that need to look like?
Or one side caves. I mean, I think I hate to use left and right, because I'm learning that in this issue that it's,
But there's no such thing.
yeah.
Right.
But for those who aren't happy with the JPA, there's real worry that the administration at the last minute will be making the major concessions and accepting
Well, yes,
a
that's
lot
what I
more
heard from all of them.
Yeah, making a lot more, accepting a lot more centrifuges than makes sense, and giving in on other things. I don't see that, but I have no way of knowing what's happening and what are really very secret negotiations.
But I think we have a different discussion about defining everything in terms of the number of centrifuges, which I think is a mistake. But I think in your broader point, Danny, about what happens, I think there's a big strategic issue especially for the U.S. and then also for the Iranians, and that's how do you shape the post-November 24th environment? And if you look at Iran's strategy, which was begun by Rouhani and Zarif in 2003, and then it was interrupted when Ahmadinejad came in for 8 years. But it was to see this as a contest between, an international contest about isolation, because we were trying to isolate Iran, and they were trying to isolate the U.S. by posing the question, which is more dangerous, the U.S. or Iran? And it's gone up and down. So between 2003, 2005, it looked like maybe the U.S. is more dangerous, and the Iranians were negotiating, they did a freeze, and then Ahmadinejad came in, all of a sudden Iran's more dangerous, and it's vacillated. So I think in a post-November 24th situation, it would be very important not to be the first one to be seen internationally to have blown up the process that most people in the world think is better than what had existed in the prior 5 years. In other words, let the Iranians make the first move. Let them be the ones that resume enrichment or enrich to 20%, and then the U.S. reacts, rather than have the U.S. act on November 25th in a way that many people would see as provocative, and then the Iranians respond to that by increasing technical activity.
But George, isn't that just a recipe for defining this deviancy down to nothingness? I mean, if we do nothing and they continue doing the sort of enough to get where they want to be, but not maybe all of it at the pace that they want, aren't they really getting a lot and we're not getting anywhere?
It's a fair question, and it's debatable, but I would say even the government of Israel would say now, after having said this, the Joint Plan of Action was the worst deal of the century, they've then corrected that and said, actually, this isn't so bad. We were wrong, was a quote. If you look at where we are today and where we've been this year compared to the prior 5 years, I think people would say that's better than the prior 5 years. So yes, it's far from imperfect, and I wouldn't want to settle for it. But there are alternatives that could be worse, that if we, for example, react with Iran seeming to be the ones that are still trying to make a deal and they're still upholding the terms of the Joint Plan of Action, and we seem to be the ones that blow up that process, you're actually going to weaken the sanctions because the Indians and others will defect from sanctions. So we end up worse off.
Hasn't everybody already defected from the sanctions?
No.
I mean, in meaningful ways, the Iranian economy has turned around in dramatic ways. The deals that are being made in Iran, notwithstanding
not deals
sanctions.
being made, there's deals being explored.
Well, there are deals being made too.
But they haven't been made, and the economy is doing better for various policy reasons that that the Rouhani people would claim and other people would verify. But even if that's true, the international situation and the concern about the advance of Iran's nuclear program is less today than it was a year ago in terms of what the momentum is and everything else. And my only point is, let them be the ones to provoke a reaction by going back to enrichment to 20% or some other provider, and then you react to that rather than acting on the absence of a final agreement on November 25th in a way that makes others think this was that the U.S. never wanted to reach a deal, basically.
Which is also an argument for extension, because I know there's been debates that, I mean, we've called it a Plan B. Like, what are you going to do? And it comes from other negotiators. I mean, not in this country. That you can't just do nothing and then just see what happens. Start making up your mind and your plans on the 25th. And so you have to game this out in a lot of different ways, and because you don't want to see uncontrolled escalation and Iran starting to make 20% and then 60% enriched uranium, deploying thousands of centrifuges. You don't want to be forced into a crisis. At the same time, I would tend to agree with you. You have to, if this is really the end. I mean, if this is, and if it's not November 24th, maybe it's in January, maybe it's in June. You have to, I think, be ready to impose sanctions. That that if and you're going to have to do everything you can to lay out why Iran is the unreasonable one, right, and prepare for that and be ready to move on that very quickly, right, and document what happened in the negotiations. Right. That just lay out in a sense what's secret now, and just make the case publicly based on what actually happened, where you can present Iran's intransigence.
But are either of you aware of any negotiations or discussions about the nature of a plan B on sanctions?
I don't think they want to do it now. I don't know about other countries, but what I hear is I don't think the United States wants to do it.
Oh no, the United States doesn't want to do it ever.
They would rather extend.
Yeah, and extend and have no leverage either.
Well, but this is the trick, and it's not a secret. I mean, it's logically obvious. I mean, similarly, nobody wants to acknowledge things will go past the deadline, because then they'd be accused of not trying to actually get an agreement and so on. And the same with sanctions is if the U.S. came along and said, let's start planning the next sanctions now, then the accusation is you were never serious about an agreement. This has always been a pretext of regime change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you fall into that, and then you lose support. So you have to wait, even though it's some strategic sense it makes more sense to plan ahead. You have to wait, and you have to do this in a politically astute way so that you get more people with you than with them at the end of the process.
Well,
yeah,
and
but it argues for secrecy. I mean,
yeah,
this is
right.
I mean, this is one argument why the administration would need to take the lead on imposing sanctions, because they can in secret work out a plan B for that day after, when and I don't think November 25th is the day after. I think this is so complicated. There's so many moving pieces to this to work out, and there's some we haven't even discussed.
Well, there's
like what have we left out?
Like,
yeah,
like sanctions. We always look at it from the standpoint, and I get this, and right, from the standpoint of how they'll not deliver, and there's a big problem of how do you reassure them that the sanctions relief, which is what's in it for them, will actually happen.
Well, in fact,
is
it
impossible.
can't.
It's impossible, right?
In fact, it
so.
can't.
Good luck in a negotiation with the other side, where the thing I want from you, you're saying, sorry, honey, you just can't have that.
Well, but George, excuse me. I mean, the Congress in its infinite wisdom has laid out a series of conditions that are not ridiculous on a whole variety of issues vis-a-vis Iran, that the president could indeed certify if Iran complies. So there is certainly a pathway, a clear pathway, for the Iranians to have sanctions lifted.
Some of those
the
conditions
problem
are
is
ridiculous or unintelligible. In other words, they're contradictory. They don't define terms. They don't. It's like a lawyer would say, you can't sign up to this because we don't know what it means.
Yeah, but if I don't want to interject, but I do want to say that the administration has made it clear that they're going to waive key things. That SWIFT, getting back into SWIFT, all kinds of
they can wire transfers,
de-designate entities. They can do a tremendous amount, and I think Iran has moved away from its position that they want legislative relief in it, as part of the deal, to being willing to accept.
Yes, it's really transformed from being the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Obama administration against the Congress to being the Americans against the Iranian nuclear weapons program. It's quite a transformation, actually. And the fact that the Obama administration in secret has been lawyering this up to figure out how they can, through a series of lies of omission and commission and waivers and the use of IAEA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, actually move forward to lift sanctions on the Iranians despite their lack of compliance with the clear intention of U.S. law, is proof positive that, in fact, things can be negotiated in secret should they wish to. But
and
they
I'm
don't
glad they've
wish
done all of those things, because otherwise, we'd
Well, let me
much
add one
worse
that can't be lifted. There's one that, because missiles are not part of this deal.
Right.
And so.
Nor is terrorism.
Well, and therefore, UN Security Council resolutions or sanctions, or at least the sanctions on proliferation-sensitive goods, which would be the ones you want for nuclear or for missile, you can't lift those, just by definition. And I think that's been accepted by the P5+1, and that you're going to have to keep those sanctions in place for a long period of time. and perhaps indefinitely if the missiles still remain a problem, or terrorism, if to the extent that's covered. And so there you have to, and Iran has, I don't know if it's accepted or not. Publicly, they've said they haven't.
Right.
You know, inside they may be more willing, but it's a big deal actually, because the goods that are used in a nuclear program, they're dual-use goods. They're also used in all kinds of other industries, and so it covers a very wide range of high-tech equipment that many Iranian industries would want, and those sanctions would not come off. And Iran would also be expected to commit not to do illicit smuggling for its nuclear program or illicit procurements for a nuclear program. And the civil industry, if it did it, would be held accountable. And
Theoretically.
Well, but there would be all the counter-proliferation methods, including interdictions, would stay in place to enforce those. And so, yeah, it's going to be harder.
How many interdictions have there been, though, David?
Well, there's been many. I mean,
Lately?
Oh, I don't. Well, most of the time they happen in secret. We hear about them typically after they've happened.
Right.
But they well, enough. I think it's I think it's.
So what are the big missing pieces? And then I want to open it up
Okay.
to the audience. I'm sorry for sucking up all of their time. But what are the big missing pieces in your estimation?
Well, one is the question of the proliferation-sensitive goods. One is Fordow. Can that remain a centrifuge R&D site, or should it just end as a centrifuge plant? And the idea is that if it's a centrifuge R&D plant, if they use the model of development that is used in Europe, which this centrifuge program is ultimately based on, that can be 1,000 centrifuges in 6 cascades. Well, and if they're 10 times or 16 times more powerful than the current generation ones, then this centrifuge R&D plant could end up with more enrichment capacity than is at Natanz now.
Right.
So you have to, and it's invulnerable to bombing. You can shut it down through bombing, and I think Israel or the United States could do that, but you wouldn't destroy the centrifuges.
Right.
And so you don't want that plant to be.
But what's the cycle? What's the life cycle? The each generation cycle for advancing by that magnitude? It's a very long time period.
Well, it's over 10 years.
Right.
Yeah, but one of the missing pieces is it's hard to judge their progress on advanced centrifuges and they confuse it because
right.
they recently introduced a new one
publicly,
the IR8, where they said it's essentially it's 16 times more powerful than the IR1.
Right. You should buy stock in that. Right?
Yeah, right. Well, we express skepticism in my organization, but it complicates it. That we don't know if they've found ways to speed things up, and so it makes a centrifuge R&D plant problematic unless the centrifuge research is capped at a very low level, and somehow verified.
Is there something you wanted to add before I open things up to the audience?
No.
So, our rules, familiar to most of you, I think. Raise your hand, I'll call on you, identify yourself and your organization, put your brilliant statement in the form of a question, and one question only. Who has a question? Maybe nobody, and then we can just continue chatting and arguing among ourselves. Yes, sir, right here.
Jared Feldschreiber, RIA Novosti, Russian Newswire. I'm a bit confused as to why there's a prevailing thought during all of this that things are somewhat mutually exclusive. The thought that that Iran has financed and funded and helped groups like Hezbollah and Hamas with the notion of the peaceful nuclear plan. I'm just trying to figure out a way to kind of reconcile the two, and while hopefully they mean what they're saying in good faith, that the Israelis are somehow vindicated for their vacillation and for their own skepticism of whatever deal comes through. It just seems like there's a prevailing, what's the word, schism between these two notions.
I'm not sure I got the question, but are you saying that because Iran supports Hamas and Hezbollah, they must have a nuclear weapon program?
No. I'm saying that there is prevailing skepticism on the side of many, whether it's AIPAC, whether it's Jewish groups throughout the U.S. and in Europe, that they feel that somehow these two things are mutually exclusive. The notion of that the peace plan is only meant, the nuclear nuclear power plant is being used peacefully. Obviously, there's a lot of vacillation.
So how can they be supporting terrorism at the same time that how can they give up one without giving up the other?
Well, I mean,
you know what I
people
think.
here have different experiences. What I've ascertained, that the government of Israel's position is they, for at least the last 15 years, have wanted the U.S. to focus on the nuclear program in Iran. So we'll handle the terrorism part. We'll handle the Hamas. You get the nuclear program. I think they are separable issues for a variety of reasons. I mean, ideally, you could solve everything at once, but I think they're separable for other reasons. But that Israel's own position is it's the nuclear program that's the existential threat. The other stuff we know how to deal with.
Yeah, I also think, I don't think we're going to warm up to Iran. So I mean, these other threats are there, and we, at my group, we only work on nuclear, so we don't work on terrorism or broader Mideast politics. But one of the things that would feed into our analysis, though, is that this isn't going to be like South Africa or even Libya, and so you've got to get more assurance of the ultimate concern that they don't have a nuclear weapons program. And that's why I think we're driven to focus more on the IAEA side of things, because that's really what tells us if they have a nuclear weapons program, not if they have a certain number of centrifuges. So we need assurance on that, and assurance that the program is ended, because we're worried that the tensions are going to be there, and when there's tensions like this, it can lead countries to reverse their decisions.
And I mean, it is, at the end of the day, while, you know, I think we disagree a little bit about the IAEA question, you know, the verification is the sort of the big gaping tunnel that everybody feels that the Iranians could drive through. Because on the one side, I think that many view the leverage and the reimposition of sanctions, even if the Iranians flagrantly violate whatever agreement they might come to, will be difficult. It was very hard to get where we got to a few years ago in the first place, and required a sort of a flagrante disregard of the rules of the road for the Iranians for a very, very long time.
No, and I think that's why the the idea is that you don't remove the sanctions authorization and architecture, you just suspend implementation. So they talk about snapback, because it would be very hard to go back and get agreement on the architecture, whether it's at the UN or anywhere else.
Yeah. Yes, sir. And then, excuse me, I don't see where I'm, yes. Here, right up front, and then over here, and then back. Just wait for the mic, please.
Armin Choksi, Clopia Global. Given the fact that the United States probably needs Iranian help and support in fighting ISIS, do you think that is likely to alter the negotiation dynamics on this nuclear issue?
My sense is not the terms that are being sought. I mean, the Iranians might think that, but I think from the U.S. point of view, my sense is it wouldn't alter the terms, but it would affect, and this is again like kind of the post-November 24, the sense of U.S. kind of interest in gains and loss and how you manage if there isn't an agreement, because you would try to avoid the magnitude of rupture that could also then complicate in unhelpful ways the ISIS thing. So you don't change the terms that you require for a quote good deal from our point of view, but you would try to manage the process more delicately, I think, than if you didn't have any other stake and this was just it, would be my.
In other words, I mean, you wouldn't focus on getting Bashar al-Assad out of power, because
Correct.
That would upset the Iranians, a policy that the administration has already embraced preemptively. So,
That's probably right. Yeah.
Right. So, yes, lovely. This gentleman over here, please.
CME in Princeton University. I was struck
Would you
by
speak up a little bit?
I was struck by David Albright's observation about what the longer-term implications might be for the robustness of the international non-proliferation regime because of how the details of the deal with Iran. So I'm just curious about what George and David think about what political and policy lessons do you think non-weapon states are learning from this process that's being played out between the United States, the IAEA, and Iran in terms of 15, 20 years ago, there was no question of the IAEA demanding this kind of access, even though it was there and available in principle. And so, and at the same time, a gradual realization of just how dangerous apparently civilian military technologies, even in relatively small programs, can be in terms of weapons. We're all starting to realize that 1,500 centrifuges can be a lot, or 4,000 is a lot, et cetera. So I'm just wondering what both of you think about what lessons non-weapon states are learning about this balance and the politics of the US, the IAEA, and non-proliferation because of what's happening with Iran right now.
Yeah, well, a couple. One is the time when the IA wouldn't ask to use its rights was in the 1980s. So the heyday was in the 90s when you had the IA demanding it in North Korea and getting the support of nations, getting it in South Africa, getting it in Taiwan, having unlimited rights in Iraq. And so that led to the additional protocol and a whole reworking of how they were going to implement safeguards. And they were going to be much more aggressive about it, integrate information from member states. What Iran represents is a pushback on all that. And you actually have Russia standing in the wings and saying, yeah, we don't want the IA to be able to do this stuff. And they're blocking in the P5+1 negotiations the +2. They don't want to have the IA gain additional precedents for additional rights. So they're playing a destructive role in getting the verification tighter. And so I think, this is, in a sense, a counter-revolution that's going on. The other part of it that is really a difficult one, which you mentioned, the danger of these small programs. They're setting a precedent that it's okay to have these programs. I do a lot of work on North Korea, and I was involved in discussing with them in 2011 that you really have to shut down your centrifuge plant. You can't keep the centrifuges spinning under vacuum. You've got to work for denuclearization. I mean, I don't think I could have that discussion in North Korea today, given what's going on in Iran. I mean, they're going to demand the ability to enrich and accept no less than what Iran gets. I mean, and then God knows what other countries are going to do. So I think that's also partly why you want to make sure that Iran's going to have to pay a very heavy price for this. This isn't negotiations between two equal partners. They're a non-compliant state, and they're going to have to, in a sense, take some serious consequences in order to be able to preserve this enrichment program. And so I'm in the camp that says, this thing's got to last 20 years. They've got to have a very small program. It's got to be a program that would take them a long time to build out from to get anywhere near a nuclear weapon. They're going to have to accept intrusive verification. And then if I go to North Korea, then I'm in a much stronger position. And others would be too, obviously, to negotiate real limits on North Korea's nuclear program.
Thank you. That will be our last question.
Thank you, Nicholas Bashir, Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I was just wondering what sort of changes might you see Russia's stance in Eastern Europe having an effect on the way the U.S. works with Russia on non-proliferation, whether it's in Iran or in North Korea or elsewhere?
Well, so far, all accounts that I've heard from people involved are that both states have compartmentalized the issue, and so the Russians haven't changed their position in the P5+1. They haven't changed their position in the work on nuclear terrorism that's ongoing. And now there's the INF treaty and the arms control process, which is bilateral, but in non-proliferation, what we're told is that it hasn't, the dynamic hasn't changed. And so on both sides there seem to have been instructions, you know, this should just continue as usual. Yeah. Which, by the way, just historically, the non-proliferation treaty was based on a joint draft by the United States and the Soviet Union, finished in 1968, the year that the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia and the U.S. was escalating in Vietnam. So non-proliferation has been an issue that historically, regardless of the competition and the loathing, they both agreed to kind of protect from politics. So that could continue.
Yeah. And one thing, though, to watch for is this deal that's being discussed between Iran and Russia on kind of, I don't know the details, if sanctions people should talk about it, but a swap. But a pretty massive, according to U.S. officials, it would be a pretty massive violation of the sanctions regime. And so if there is no deal and escalation starts, will Russia make a different calculation that it wants to, you know, in a sense, create an alternative coalition, in this case with Iran, and probably China would join, and it would be to try to maximize their economic advantage and weaken sanctions from the West.
I do think that sort of as we close out, one thing is that we have a tendency to talk about this as a bilateral issue between us and the Iranians, and to sort of, yes, you know, we talk about Assad and the Russians, but at the end of the day, if oil prices go down, continue to go down, that's going to hurt the Russians and the Iranians. The incentives to misbehave, both to raise the price back up again, but also just for their own political reasons, are high. If there's a, you know, if Assad falls, although God knows if he will, then obviously the Iranians are going to be even more nervous about their status in the region. The Gulf countries already hate them. I mean, there are a whole number of other shoes to drop here that, and this isn't going to happen absent any of those other events. So it's going to be quite interesting to watch. And of course, we'll have a new Congress one way or another next year. So we'll see just how much they're going to put up with from the administration as we move forward. We will still have lots to talk about. Let me thank both of you very much for being here, and all of you as well.
Thank you for joining.